Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. On 7th October, we saw Hamas launch violent terror attacks across Israel, leaving several dead. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, in response, has launched a war on Gaza, disproportionately killing civilians across the country. While efforts have been made by international organizations to initiate a ceasefire, there seems to be no end to this unrest, not just between the two countries, but also in the Middle East in general. Joining us today to discuss the Gaza crisis and what it means for India is Prof. C Raja Mohan, visiting research professor here at ISAS. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Despite traditional fault lines between Israel and the Arab nations, India has obtained a fine balance in the Middle East. How has India been able to obtain this finesse, and how will the current crisis disturb that balance?
No, the fine balance in India's relations with both the Arabs and Israel is really a consequence of the emergence of a peace process in the beginning of the 1990s. Because if you remember, during the Cold War, India was really much more closer to the Arabs. It was a strong votary of Arab causes. It had no full diplomatic relations with Israel. Though India was one of the first countries to recognize Israel, it did not establish full diplomatic relations until the early 1990s. So you could say until the turn of the 1990s, that is through much of the Cold War, India's policy was totally tilted towards the Arabs. Now, I think once the Arabs and Israelis themselves began to negotiate in the Oslo peace process, and then we had the, Israel-Palestine engagement. So that, I think, created the opening for India to establish one, full diplomatic relations with Israel, as well as step up the engagement with the Arab nations. And this decision, I think, was not taken easily. The government of P.V. Narasimha Rao spent a lot of time, because in India there was a lot of hostility towards Israel. So he had to really take the range of opinion into account, consult most foreign policy experts. So it's with great deliberation, and in fact they consulted the Arab leaders. In fact, Mr. Rao also consulted Arafat, who was then the leader of the Palestinians, before going with the normalization of relations with Israel. So I think it is really the change in the nature of the relationship between Arabs and Israelis that allowed India to have a balanced relationship. So that's also the reason why today for India, it's really a sad situation, because I think as long as there was a peace process going on, as long as there was no major confrontation within the region, India could engage all sides, which was what the situation has been. In the last 30 years, India's relationship with Israel has deepened. There's a lot more defense cooperation, technological cooperation, and with Arabs too, because Arabs are, the oil, India's relationship with the Gulf. Today, India has almost 9 million Indian workers in the Arab Gulf. It has this Indian diaspora in the Gulf contributes nearly $100 billion of remittances. And trade, for example, the United Arab Emirates is one of India's leading trade partners, and the Gulf countries are also major investors in Indian economy. So all this was possible because there were a reasonable relationship between Israel and the Arabs. And what we saw in the 30 years after 1990, really more and more Arab countries were engaging Israel, and that was welcome for India, because as long as the region was at peace with itself, India could engage both sides. But today, I think this crisis and the tragedy and the intensity of the carnage that is going on in Gaza really casts a shadow over India's Middle East policy.
Absolutely. I think in the last year as well as this year, we saw that there was a lot of focus on dialogue between the Arab nations and Israel, and we had the Saudi Arabia-Israel dialogue that was supposed to happen, which has now been suspended for the time being. So given the current context, how have other extra-regional but great powers situated themselves in this conflict? And how should India situate itself as an extra-regional power within the conflict?
Look, I think most of the Western powers and Russia, Soviet Union historically, and China always had good relations with both sides. So India was an exception in that sense because of the tradition of anti-colonialism, the non-aligned movement. During the Cold War, India was tilted towards the Arab side, but for Russia had good relations with both sides. You had Americans had strong relationship with Arabs as well as with Israel. The Europeans, of course, were former colonial powers in the region, as well as having good relations with the both sides. China too. I think over the last 40 years, has had good relations with both sides. So India was somewhat becoming like a normal major power that engages all sides rather than taking a very rigid ideological position. But now, in the current crisis, clearly Russia and China are tilting towards positions which are hostile to Israel. Not fully, but signaling that they support the Palestinians and oppose Israel's military invasion. And it's not as much they're opposed to Israel, actually. They use the occasion to attack the United States. Both China and Russia say, look, it's all US's fault because of US support for Israel. All this stuff is happening. So for their emphasis is really see this through the lens of their competition and confrontation with the United States, rather than through the lens of the Arab-Israeli dispute, because they still maintain relations with both sides.
So I think this is one of the first times in the last 30 years also that India's support for Israel, especially when it came through Prime Minister Narendra Modi's initial condemnation of the Hamas attack, sort of initiated a lot of discussion on what side does India take within this conflict. We have not seen this kind of support before. What factors, in your view, are driving this support? Are they more realist foreign policy driven from India's perspective, or does it have more to do with our domestic politics and the current establishment, which is led by the BJP government?
I think you're absolutely right. There is a change in India's approach to the UN resolutions and voting. Historically, India tended to vote with the Arabs on a routine basis. That it really didn't matter what was in the resolution, that Indians would always vote for the Arab resolutions. But this time India abstained from the resolution calling for a humanitarian truce. And India explained that vote by saying that, look, there was no mention of terrorism in the resolution, and that the Hamas attack was not mentioned in the resolution that got approved by 120 votes. So India's main argument is not that India's fundamental position has changed. Look, I think we got to understand in the UN, a lot of the voting depends on the technical questions, what exactly is in the resolution, whether all interests are taken into account. So most of the time what countries do is, while they vote because of a particular set of reasons, they also give an explanation of the vote. In India's explanation of the vote of abstention, it said, look, clearly one reason not mentioned terror, but at the same time, it talked about its concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the need to stop violence against civilians. So in a sense, it's saying all the right things. But I think the difference between the past and the present is the fact that India was not willing to duck the question of terrorism. So if you look at in the past, what India did was, look, it always talked about terrorism from Pakistan. But when it came to the Middle East, it would keep quiet when the question was about terrorism originating from the Arab sources or from Israel's neighbors. India would not take a position. I think that's what has changed, where India is saying now that terrorism is terrorism and we're going to take a position. In fact, after the UN vote, India's External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, mentioned this very clearly, that India is taking a strong position on terrorism because India is a victim of terrorism. And that India can't have a double standard that when India is affected by terrorism, it takes a strong position. But when others are affected by terrorism, it would not take a position on those issues. So in some sense, what Delhi is saying is that they brought a measure of consistency to the Indian position. Yeah, I think related to this, it's also important to understand that contrary to much of the global debate, either you are for Palestine or for Israel, to one where India and a large number of countries are saying that, look, you can be against terrorism of the kind that Hamas did, the brutal massacre of so many Israelis. So I think if you define terrorism as an attack against innocent civilians, then I think what Hamas did was terrorism, and that deserved to be condemned. But at the same time, it's also important, I think, that you can also still be a supporter of Palestine, of Palestinian statehood, of a two-state solution. So India has not given up on that position. What India is saying is that, look, it's terrorism of Hamas is not acceptable, while India continues to support Palestinian statehood, and that it will continue to oppose the kind of humanitarian conditions that exist in Gaza. So I think it is a modification, but I don't think there's any fundamental giving up of the basic positions either on Palestine or on the question of Israel-Palestine dispute.
Absolutely. I think thank you for bringing in that lens. And if I could summarize a little bit of what you said, that maybe it is bringing in our own principles on terrorism that are sort of becoming a key part of our foreign policy, that would be a good example when we look at the Gaza conflict in totality. Now, another key regional power has been Iran, and India and Iran have shared a very special relationship. However, when it comes to the Gaza crisis, what one sees is that Iran's support for the Palestinian people is quite outright, and their opposition towards Israel is also becoming clearer. In that scenario, how does India navigate its strategic relationship with Iran, especially given that in recent times, especially with IMEC, it may have become better? So how would India navigate that?
Ever since Islamic Republic of Iran was formed, it remained as deeply hostile to Israel, and it has championed the cause of Palestine sometimes more vigorously than the Arabs themselves. So in some ways, I mean, if you are cynical, you could say Iran was trying to use the Palestinian question to out-Arab the Arabs, to say that, look, it was purer than the Arabs, it to stand up for the cause of Palestine more than the Arab countries. Because by the time Islamic Republic was formed, some countries in Arab world had already begun to normalize relationship with Israel, like Egypt. So I think Iran presents itself as a champion of the Palestinian cause, and as fundamentally refusing to accept the existence of Israel as a state. So it's a very deeply ideologically held position. So if Iran and Israel on the other hand has seen Iran as the principal enemy. So for nearly 30, 40 years, I mean, that the hostility between the two has been intense. But until now, India could happily manage both maintain an expanding relationship with Israel and at the same time engage Iran as part of South Asia's neighborhood. Because India had special interest in Iran. Iran is a neighbor of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And India needed access to Afghanistan and Central Asia because we could not get access through Pakistan. It was interested in working with Iran to get the Chabahar port, the construction of roads and railway to connect to Central Asia. And there was also this idea India would work with Iran and Russia to develop a corridor into Inner Asia and Europe. So these could be simultaneously, like most countries do. India was navigating this tension by engaging both sides. But now I think we are in a situation where the current situation in the Middle East could expand to include a larger war, a general war, in which Israel would at some point could target Iran, and if Iran steps up the attacks through Hezbollah and into Israel. So I think now we are in the danger of a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. If that happens, I think it's going to get harder for India to navigate this contradiction. But India is not alone. While most Western countries are totally with Israel, India will have a special problem in a way because of Iran as a neighbor, Iran is of special importance for India in the Afghan question and the Central Asia question. Therefore, I think navigating this will now become harder if Iran and Israel directly get into a fight. But then the world is never according to your wishes. You'll have to deal with what exists.
The consequences of walking on a tightrope.
Yeah.
I think another key regional power, and this is particularly essential because it can draw back into India's own domestic politics, is Turkey. I think Turkey's regional ambitions at this time are also swaying Middle East politics quite significantly, especially given their focus on the value of Muslim brotherhood, which is something that has constantly come up when we talk about the Palestine issue. So, given that Turkey's similar focus on Kashmir has previously created challenges for India, how, in your opinion, should India navigate through these ambitions, and how would this impact India-Turkey relations?
I think India-Turkey relations have not been in a good place for a long time. In the past, India had difficulties with Turkey during the Cold War, but then Turkey then was a secular state, really. But it was in alliance with Pakistan and the West in the Middle East. But today, I think the problem between India and Turkey is, while there are a lot of common interests on the economic side, Turkey's support for Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey's support for Pakistan on the Kashmir question, and its support for Islamic radicalism has become a major bone of contention for India, and therefore this is, in fact, it's a continuing issue for India, and it is trying to manage it, but the relationship is not good. But then I think Turkey is not only at odds with India, but it's actually, there is a bigger problem for the Arab states, because the Turkish leader, Erdogan might think of himself as restoring the Ottoman Empire, but no Arab would want to see a restoration of the old empire in which they were subordinate players. So actually the contradiction between Turkey and the Arab leaders is, moderate Arabs, is even stronger. We've seen some effort at reconciling that in the region. So in that sense, we're not alone. I mean, most Arab countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they all have their own problems with Turkey, because the brotherhood and ideology is less of a threat to India than to Egypt, than to Saudi Arabia, than to United Arab Emirates. So I think it's really the Gulf countries and Egypt which are threatened by brotherhood. And after all, if you remember, there was a government of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, which was backed fully by Turkey. And also Qatar is another element in this. That eventually Egyptian military stepped in to oust Mohammed Morsi, was an elected leader, and to restore the old order in Egypt. So India's contradiction with Turkey is not as strong as that between Arabs and Turkey, but I think it's an issue that exists. On the question of Qatar is a Gulf Arab country, but Qatar has been playing a very, shall we say, depending on where you sit, a fascinating role. It plays all sides. It has American military bases on the one hand. It has hosted the Taliban, sitting in five-star hotels in Doha. Now it has Hamas leaders sitting in Doha. So on the one hand, they become the mediators for the release of hostages, between Israeli hostages. But at the same time, they're also the strongest supporters of Muslim Brotherhood. The Al Jazeera channel is one of the greatest champions of all these radical issues. So I think they have been far more, shall we say, dynamic, if you will, policy, which has threatened a lot of the other Arab countries themselves, even for India. I mean, I think Qatar is really, if you see what Al Jazeera does on Kashmir, is far more hostile than anybody else in the world. So I think Qatar is a very interesting case in the region, though it is a Gulf Sunni Arab state. Its politics, its support for brotherhood, have complicated the region quite dramatically.
I think it's going to be quite challenging, because we started this year with, I think, one of the articles in Foreign Affairs which said that the possibility of peace in the Middle East is highly likely. But I think we are ending the year on a completely different note, with extreme concerns around international law and humanitarian rights, and of course change in geopolitics in totality, especially in the Middle East. But one of the key cases that has actually emerged for the region has been India's role in the Middle East. So traditionally, India was against the US's intervention in the Middle East. However, in the last 2 years, particularly, especially actually if we can just go back to September, we saw the launch of two major initiatives. One was the I2U2 and the other is the IMEC. So my question to you is surrounding what your opinion on the future of these two initiatives could be. Would they be eclipsed under the politics of the Middle East? And how did actually India come around to eventually supporting the US in launching these two initiatives? Of course, they have more partners. In case of the I2U2, you have the UAE as well, and several other supporters in IMEC. But these were two extremely surprising events, if I may say so, which have been the talk of town in terms of connectivity, infrastructure, and also shift in support within geopolitics.
No, there's several parts to what you asked. I mean, I think the first one, in fact, even just a few weeks ago, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was saying Middle East has been quiet. They were very hopeful that their effort at bringing Israel and Saudi Arabia would complete the Abraham Accords, which started under the Trump administration when Bahrain, United Arab Emirates began to normalize ties with Israel, and this is an idea that this thing would go further. But I think what's happened, the Hamas attack and the Israeli retribution, that these together have actually dramatically changed the mood and the context of the regions. So therefore, what seemed that we were moving towards peace breaking out, and a new Middle East taking shape, a Middle East in which old animosities can be curbed, there'll be more connectivity, more trade, more integration. That whole conception of a new Middle East has been shattered by this. Second, I think the idea of the corridors, both the India-Middle East corridor to Europe, was part of this idea of a new Middle East. That is, a Middle East that is at peace with itself would create conditions under which India could, connect with Arabia, and from Arabia to Europe, that you would have this vast set of connectivities. Because historically, civilizationally, the subcontinent enjoyed immense connectivity with Arabia and then Mediterranean. So we were really looking at a historic restoration of the existing connectivities. But I think this crisis clearly casts a shadow on it because it involved actually Israel, Saudi Arabia, and a measure of peace in the region. So that now the officials were supposed to meet, and they announced it at the G20 summit. They're supposed to meet in the next few weeks. So I think I would say wait and see. But I don't think the idea will go away. It is the question of near-term challenges. After all, the war is not going to last forever. Hopefully, you can never say anything with confidence in the Middle East. So I think at this point, at least, there is a cloud over the project. The third aspect you raised was how is it that India, sitting with the US in whether it is the IMEC or the I2U2. Historically, India opposed the US alliances in the Middle East. India was opposed to colonialism, imperialism, and then US was seen a legatee of European imperialism. Therefore, India was daggers drawn on against the US policies in the Middle East. So I think that today that India is working with the US to stabilize the region is a huge shift in India's worldview. Because even 3 years ago, people used to say, look, India will work with the US in the Indo-Pacific because of the larger questions of balance of power, the question of China, etc. But in the Middle East, India would never work with the US. But that's changed because I think the US sees a rising India could take larger responsibilities, and the contradictions between India and the US have significantly reduced. So therefore, I think what we're seeing is for the first time, India ready to work with the US. And the other unstated element of it is really that India's relationship with the so-called moderate Arab states have significantly improved. So that is a big change. So which gives that India's relationship, one of the biggest changes under Modi government has been the improved relations with UAE and Saudi Arabia. which was historically, again, something very a significant departure. And I think this created a basis for India to rethink the region fundamentally, not as hostile to the West or not as hostile to the conservative Arab states. Because in the past, India was, say, if you framed it as republics versus monarchies, the republics being socialist, the guys in suits versus the guys in Arab robes. I mean, our tendency was to be with the socialist, nationalist Arabs. But today, I think India does more business with the moderate Arab states, and they are comfortable with India, and I think this has created a new basis for engaging the region. That also, overall at the global level, the convergences between India and the US have grown. On the security side, on the strategic side. So it is clearly a new phase, how India thinks about the region, that it can work with the US in this region. So I think this really changes the way India relates to the Middle East in a very fundamental way.
Thank you so much for your insights on what are the changing aspects of India's foreign policy and how the current Gaza conflict impacts this as well. Thank you so much for your time again. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.